Hello, I'm Omer Jacob, and I'm a news editor for Haaretz in English. I'm here with Amos Harel, Haaretz's senior military correspondent and analyst. And we're here at what seems to be a very pivotal moment. Yeah, so the U.S. is pulling out of Syria. Rockets from Gaza seem to be threatening the always fragile calm, and the IDF chief is wrapping up his term. So Amos, let's start with the north. Talk to me a little bit about the end of Operation Northern Shield.
Not only that, but an Israeli announcement for the first time, or one of the first times, that Israel actually admits attacking Iranian targets in Syria. Chief of Staff Eisenkot hinted to that yesterday when he spoke with the New York Times, and now at the beginning of the cabinet meeting, the Prime Minister has come out in the open and said it loudly. We struck Iranian targets near Damascus on Friday. So it may be the end of Israeli ambiguity. Israel has maintained a position for the last 5 years or so, where usually we did not actually announce or admit that it was Israeli planes, although everybody knew that Israel was behind the attacks. Yeah, now we no longer need to say allegedly, apparently, because Netanyahu is saying it loud and clear. Having mentioned that, there's also the issue regarding the tunnels. The operation, they've managed to discover and destroy 6 tunnels which were dug by Hezbollah under the Israeli-Lebanese border. They've announced the operation December 3rd, and today they've said that this is the last tunnel to be discovered and actually the end of the operation. It's not the end of the story, because Israel continues to build the wall along the border in some areas in which there are disputes with the Lebanese government, especially a specific area between the 2 kibbutzim, Manara and Misgavam, may be the beginning of the next problem with Lebanon.
It feels that Lebanon suddenly at least the average reader, Lebanon is now suddenly back in the headlines after what seems like a long time when it wasn't. Do you see that connected to what's happening in Syria? The pullout generally?
I think so. I think the Syrian civil war is not exactly ended, but it's rather clear who won. It's the Iranian side, the Russian side, and actually the Assad regime that ended this with victory. Most of Hezbollah's fighters are now back home in Lebanon, some of them in southern Lebanon. And Israel keeps acting along the border, not only dealing with the tunnels, but there's the open discussion regarding those factories in which Iran and Hezbollah plan to produce more accurate weapons, more accurate rockets and missiles. Netanyahu, when he spoke at the UN, that was last September, actually mentioned specific places, specific sites in which those factories were apparently built, and threatened that Israel would respond. A few days later, the Lebanese government invited diplomats and journalists to visit there. Of course, nothing remained. But we assumed that Hezbollah would try again at one point or another, and that would put Israel in front of quite a dilemma whether to strike at those factories. This would be the first strike of its kind after 12.5 years of relative calm along the border. And this may mean a new crisis with Lebanon. So Syria is not over yet, but Lebanon is back in the headlines.
Let me ask you about Gaza, where the botched operation a few weeks ago led to a very, very dramatic weekend that then actually was followed by calm. And suddenly this weekend things have kind of heated up again and we had rockets again. Why do you think that's happening now?
Look, we're back at square one. It goes back not to the occupation, but to the animosity between the 2 different political camps among the Palestinians. Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, is fed up with Hamas. He's fed up with the fact that he has to provide tens of millions of dollars every month to Hamas workers, some officials who used to work for the Palestinian Authority in Gaza and so on. And he's gradually applying more and more pressure, economic pressure on Hamas regarding that. Hamas is stuck between a rock and a hard place, and it's trying to move out of this situation by threatening Israel and by gradually deteriorating the situation along the border, all those weekend demonstrations and so on, the border marches. There's also the question regarding the border passages, more than anything else, the Rafah crossing to Sinai. Right now, Abbas has pulled out some of his men from the Rafah crossing. It took the Egyptians some time to decide what their new policy about this was going to be. What they've announced, I think, during the weekend is that people can come inside Gaza, can enter Gaza, but not go out through the Rafah crossing. This means more pressure from Egypt on Hamas, and this means more tension along the border as we approach. I think that the most important date right now is the beginning of April, the Israeli elections. And Hamas knows very well that it can put Netanyahu in an uncomfortable position by gradually escalating the situation along the border.
And financially, we reported extensively about the Qatari money that is physically being airlifted into Gaza. Do you see that as a alleviating factor? Or does it help, or does it make matters more complex? This kind of new, not new, but this international force that is also active in Gaza?
The Qatari money is inconvenient for Israel, especially for a right-wing government. It looks like money for terrorists. It looks like Israel is paying bribes or helping to pay bribes in order for the Hamas organization to stop shooting rockets at Israel. So it's inconvenient for Netanyahu, especially as we approach the elections. On the other hand, it does provide them with some means to survive for some more time, and this is why Netanyahu is not happy about this, but has agreed to continue this arrangement for the next few months. It seems that last week, because of the violence, that Israel stepped on the brakes regarding the money, but the money is supposed to arrive in Gaza in the next few days. If it does, it may help us with the next few weeks of quiet, but I think my suspicion is that things wouldn't remain as relatively calm as they were during the last few months, and that we'll see some kind of escalation once we get closer to the elections.
Pompeo's speech and this kind of, feeling that we're no longer dealing with the most coherent White House, and that you do have forces like Bolton and Pompeo pulling in different directions. How does that play out for Israel? Is that good for us?
Well, you put it mildly. This is the strangest administration Israel has ever faced. Netanyahu cannot say that publicly. First of all, it's impolite. Other than that, he built quite a lot of his political power in recent years on that projection of his relationship with President Trump. The best friends, the closest international leader to Trump, and so on. So he cannot come out publicly and say anything about that. And you've noticed that Israeli ministers and also the leaders of Israel's intelligence community have been very, very cautious about saying anything regarding Trump's policies. Behind closed doors, there's a different attitude, and people are worried. It's very, very hard to tell where the administration is heading. I think they're heading in one direction, which is pulling out of the Middle East more than before. Syria is quite clear right now. So it's going to be one step forward, two steps back, because this is the nature of this administration. But I think that Israel understands, it doesn't admit it publicly, but it does understand that things are changing in the region. We may still have United States back, but we're on our own on the daily basis. If something terrible happens, I assume that President Trump as well would allow some assistance to Israel. But on the daily basis of handling the changing environment here, and these are things that are happening all the time, I think that Netanyahu understands that he's more alone than before. Now, there's going to be a pullout. There are two major questions for Israel. One is how fast this is going to happen. The second has to do with Tanif. Tanif is the American base, which is closer to the Iraqi and Jordanian border. It's far away from Israel, but it's actually stuck in the middle of the highway between Tehran and Damascus and Beirut. So for Israel, it's extremely important that the Americans remain there. We'll see what happens. Right now, it seems that they are going to pull out, but this is something that the Israelis emphasize when they speak to their American counterpart.
And how does this insecurity regarding America and its plans, how does that play into our confidence about Russia's plan and Russia's ongoing presence? Is the pullout of the U.S. also, is there a mirror image of Russia kind of doubling down in Syria?
Look, the Middle East has changed, and the most drastic change that happened after the so-called Arab Spring of 2010-2011 is the Russian comeback. The fact that the Russians are here since 2015, in September 2015, Putin deployed 2 squadrons of airplanes, of fighter planes, in order to assist Assad. Since then, they're here in a major way. And I'm not saying that they're the only power, that this is the only game in town, but we do have a giant in our back door, in our backyard now, and we need to tread lightly. And Netanyahu actually has been very quick to identify that. And remember, immediately after the planes arrived in Latakia Tartus, that area in northern Syria,
The Russian planes.
The Russian planes, Netanyahu took the first plane to Moscow, and since then he met with Putin, I think, 10 times. And this is because he realizes how important this is to establish a personal connection with Putin. However, we shouldn't be too naive about that. The Russians are more cynical than anybody else in this game, and it's not about their sympathies towards Israel. Moscow is going to do what's good for Moscow. And I think during a few months last year, some of Netanyahu's most avid supporters tried to portray this as if Netanyahu has this all controlled, he handles everything, he can play Trump against Putin and Putin against Trump. This is not the reality. It's much more complicated than that. And Israel realizes that it's not the strongest player in the region, but it does have to deal with the Russians more directly than before, because we cannot no longer hide behind America's back.
Final question about the other giant involved that you've reported about, China. So Israel is kind of warming up its ties, mostly economic ties, and this is starting to have a defense aspect or a defense price, or is inspiring concerns?
China has become quite an issue. It took Israel some time to realize how angry this makes the Americans, and specifically the Trump administration, because of the battle for trade with the Chinese and so on. But if we go back to 2014, it was Netanyahu who was extremely happy about improving relationship with China, and actually passed a cabinet decision saying we need to push forward as much as we can on trade. Most recently, in the last few months, it appears that the Americans made it very clear to Israel that Israel has went too far, especially when it comes to infrastructure and some sensitive matters that have to do with communications and so on. And now Netanyahu is taking a step back. He cannot do this too publicly. He doesn't want to offend the Chinese. There's a lot of money on the table. But on the other hand, you've seen already cabinet decisions to further look into this matter. You've seen the different Israeli security agencies being quite careful about purchasing any kind of Chinese-made mobile phones and so on. I think we'll see more of this because the tensions between Washington and Beijing will continue. Israel is only a small player in this field, but Israel needs to look at this carefully and to watch for what the United States is doing and what it expects from us.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.